Hello students, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Himanshu Arora from Department of Anthropology, University of Delhi. Today we are going to study a module Demography and Religion from the paper Demographic Anthropology. First of all, let's start with the learning objectives of the module. Through this module, you will be able to understand the demographic profile of religion in the world. You will study the historical distribution of religion in India. Now we'll give you a glimpse of the topic through a brief introduction. Demography studies the changing size and composition of a population in a quantitative way. A population is usually defined as comprising all the people in a given territory or political entity. That is, from a city to a province to a nation or the world population. A population defined in such a way can only change through three forces: birth, death, and migration. These are called the three fundamental components of demographic change. Since the intensity of these forces differs greatly by age and gender, most demographic studies stratify the population by these two basic demographic dimensions. This structure by age and gender is well illustrated through population pyramids, which plot women on the right and men on the left side, sorted by age. Demographic models can also project populations for several decades into the future. This high predictive power in demography, as compared to many other social and economic issues, is due to the fact that the human lifespan is 70 to 80 years in most parts of the world, and if we know, for example, the number of 10-year-old girl today, we have a good basis for projecting the number of 7-year-old women 60 years in the future. We only have to adjust for assumed future mortality and migration rates. To project the size of cohorts that have not yet been born today, we almost must make assumptions about future fertility rates. Hence, to forecast total population size, we need to make assumptions about likely future trends in age and gender-specific birth, death, and migration rates. Populations can and should be stratified by other characteristics of humans than just age and gender. Traditionally, demographers have also distinguished population by marital status, place of residence, citizenship, educational attainment level, and ethnicity. Religious affiliation is another characteristic that has been included in the census of many countries. In some countries, however, it is not considered appropriate for the state to ask about membership in religious organization. Now we will discuss word diversity of distribution of religious population. When it comes to the question of demographic modeling of the changing distribution of the religious composition of a population, differentials in fertility, mortality, and migration can be considered. Recently, the number and proportion of Muslims in many European countries has been increasing quite rapidly. This is, in the first instance, a consequence of the fact that many immigrants to Europe have been Muslims, either from Turkey or from Northern Africa. But it is also due to the fact that in most countries, Muslim women had significantly higher birth rates. Several estimates for relative and absolute composition of religion in the world exist. The word Christian Encyclopedia suggests that in 2010, Christianity constituted 33.2% of the world population, Islam 22.4%, Buddhism 6.8%, and Hinduism 13.7%. They also estimate that 100 years ago, in 1910, Christianity was at 34.8%, Islam 12.6%, Buddhism 7.8%, and Hinduism 12.7%. Distribution of religion in India. The changing religious profile of Indian population has had a strong impact on the recent history of India. and it continues to be amongst the major determinants of strife on the Indian subcontinent. Fortunately, unlike the caste and community affiliations, the religious affiliations of the people of India have always been recorded in the census operations. Now we'll talk about historical background of religious composition of India. At the time of the first detailed census in 1881, the adherents of religions of native Indian origin constituted about 79% of the population, of which 95% were Hindus. Of the remaining about 21% of the population that followed religions of alien origin, as many as 96% were Muslims. This religious heterogeneity of the Indian population and its division into mainly the Hindus and the Muslims was a demographic reflection of a relatively recent events in Indian history. Up to about 1200 AD, India showed remarkable religious and civilizational homogeneity. Notwithstanding the great geographical expanse of India and the linguistic and cultural specifications of people living in different regions, there prevailed an almost timeless consensus on fundamental civilizational principles. These basic principles of India, which found diverse expressions in sophisticated philosophical discourse as well as in lay benefits and practices, are collectively known by the name of Sanatan Dharma, the timeless discipline that forms the core of all religious doctrines of Indian origin. All those who entered India from outside soon accepted these basic civilizational principles. In fact, up to the coming of Darius of Persia in the 6th century BC and Alexander of Macedonia in the 4th century BC, there were few external incursions into India. This had partly to do with the peculiar geography of India. The Indian subcontinent enjoyed remarkable isolation from rest of the world. The land frontier in the north is blocked by the high and wide wall of the Himalaya, which is impassable except at a few points in the northwest. The long sea coasts in the south are far away from any other major lands and have few natural harbors. The land enclosed within these impregnable frontiers is one of the richest in the world. It is therefore not surprising that Indians living securely within their vast and fertile lands for millennia without fear of external aggression or internal scarcity developed into a homogeneous civilizational area. This homogeneity was anchored in Sanatan Dharma. Indians living in their splendid and rich isolation were at peace with themselves, with nature and the world. The Sanatan Dharma enshrines at its heart a sense of deep respect for all the aspects of creation. Kanishka, the greatest of the Kushana kings, established an empire that extended from central and western India to Central Asia. He is also known to have been a devoted follower of Buddhism and to have conveyed the fourth Bodh Sangh in Kashmir. Starting from 17th century AD, India faced a new external incursion, this time by the adherents of Islam. Islam, as is known, arrived on the world scene with great expansionary vigor. Prophet Muhammad was born in 570 AD. In a single decade between 622 AD, when he arrived at Medina, to 632 AD, when he died. He had consolidated Arabia into a powerful and unified political and religious unit. In another decade following his death, the Islamic caliphs had expanded the boundaries of Muslim power to cover almost the whole of Byzantine and Sassanid territories, the two great powers of the time. Between 637 and 643 AD, Persia was conquered and the Islamic borders touched Afghanistan. Egypt fell in 640 AD. In 711 AD, Spain was conquered. Then southern France was annexed. Within 100 years of the Prophet's death, Arabs became the rulers of a vast region encompassing most of the southern Europe and northern Africa and all of West and Central Asia. Islamic naval and land expeditions began exploratory incursions on Indian borders from as early as 636 AD, but Islam could obtain a foothold in India only in 713 AD with the victory over Sindh. India successfully resisted further spread of Islam into Indian territories for the next 3 centuries. From the beginning of 11th century AD, India began facing rapacious Islamic invaders of Turkish origin. Mahmud Ghazni invaded India several times from 1000 to 1026 AD and annexed Punjab to his empire. The Ghur successors to the Ghazni Empire were finally able to extend Islamic conquest into the heart of India after defeating the valorous Prithviraj Chauhan in 1192 AD. Thus, in contrast to the easy conquest the Islamic forces had in many parts of the world, it took them more than 5 centuries to break the defenses of India. From 1119 to around the end of the 17th century, various Islamic dynasties derived from the Turco-Afghans and later the Central Asian Mughals ruled over large parts of India. These about 5 centuries of Islamic rule constitute the first period in long and unbroken history of India when India was ruled by a group that did not subscribe to the fundamental civilizational and religious principles of India. Islamic rulers, even those who were relatively tolerant of the Indian beliefs and practices and did not attempt to forcibly propagate Islam, were committed to retaining a distinct Islamic identity and presence within the larger and otherwise homogeneous civilization of India. Unlike all those who came into India before them, the Islamic rulers consciously and perhaps unconsciously resisted acculturation into the timeless civilization and religious milieu of India, thus became the first source of heterogeneity in India, dividing the Indian population mainly into two distinct religious communities, Hindus and Muslims, as reflected in the 1881 census. In time, this demographic heterogeneity led to the partition of the country into Indian Union and two separate Islamic enclaves. Peninsular India, consisting of the southern Malayalam, Kannada, Tamil and Telugu regions, had largely escaped Islamic domination. Islamic incursions into this part of India in the early 14th century led to a powerful consolidation under the mighty Vijayanagara Empire that was emphatically committed to the defense of Sanatan Dharma. From about the middle of the 17th century, people all over India under several charismatic leaders began to rise in revolt against the Mughal rule in almost all parts of India. The Marathas under Samartha Ramdas and his great disciple Shivaji, the Jats under Gokula and the Sikhs under Guru Gobind Singh created powerful military organization that shook the Mughal Empire. By the end of the century, the empire had more or less collapsed, and indigenous rulers were in the process of establishing themselves everywhere in India. In 1881, after about a century of British rule, Christians were just beginning to make their presence felt in India and constituted about 0.7% of the population. But the proportion of Muslims has risen to about 20% from about 16% indicated at the pinnacle of Mughal rule. Now we will talk about religious profile of India. The part of India that came to form Indian Union after partition has a substantial majority of Indian religionists, but their proportion has been declining throughout the 20th century, except for the rise associated with the abnormal and traumatic event of partition. In the pre-partition period, the proportion of Indian religionists in this part of India declined from 86.6% in 1901 to 84.4% in 1941. Between 1941 and 1951, their proportion rose by about 2.8 percent points as a result of the forced and violent transfer of populations that occurred at the time of partition. And in the following 4 decades, the proportion of Indian religionists in Indian Union has declined by the same 2.2 percentage point as in the 4 decades prior to the partition for which we have the data. Consequently, there has been a net decline of 1.6 percentage point in the proportion of Indian religionists in India in Indian Union between 1901 and 1999. Now we will discuss religious composition in India from 1881 to 1991. The proportion of Indian religionists in the population of India has declined by 11 percentage points during the period of 110 years, for which census information is available. Indian religionists formed 79.32% of the population in 1881 and 68.3% in 1991. Correspondingly, the proportion of Muslims in India has increased by almost 10 percent point from about 20% to 30%. The proportion of Christians during the same period had risen from 0.7% to 2%. The decline in the share of Indian religionists and the corresponding rise in that of Muslims has been a continuous process throughout the period, and the phenomenon does not seem to have abated yet. The proportion of Christians, however, seems to have reached a plateau after having risen continuously for 90 years between 1881 and 1971. A decline of 11 percentage point in the share of the major community in a compact geographical and civilizational region like India is an extraordinary occurrence to happen in the course of just about a century. At the peak of Mughal rule at the time of Akbar, after nearly 400 years of Islamic domination, the proportion of Muslims in India was said to have reached no more than 1/6 of the population. Table shows religious composition of India from 1881 to 1991. Population growth rate of various religion has come down in the last decade from 2001 to 2011. Hindu population growth rate has slowed down to 16.76% from previous decade figure of 19.92%, while Muslim witnessed sharp fall in the growth rate to 24.6% from the previous figures of 29%. Such sharp fall in population growth rate for Muslims did not happen in the last 6 decades. Christian population growth rate was at 15.5%, while Sikh population growth rate stood at 8.4%. The most educated and wealthy community of Jains registered least growth rate in 2001 to 2011 with a figure of just 5.4%. Table shows All India Religion Census Data 2011, according to which there are 79.8% Hindus, 14.2% Muslims, 2.3% Christians, 1.7% Sikhs, 0.7% Buddhists, and 0.3% Jains. The present table shows Urban India Religion Census Data 2011, according to which there are 74% Hindus, 18.23% Muslims, 2.9% Christians, 1.5% Sikhs, 0.9% Buddhists, and 0.9% Jains. The table shows Rural India Religious Census Data 2011, according to which there are 82% Hindu, 12.4% Muslims, 2% Christians, 1.7% Sikhs, 0.5% Buddhist, 0.11% Jains. Now we will talk about the share of India in the world. The most striking fact about the historical demography of the world is the sharp rise in the share of people of European stock that began to take place from around middle of the 18th century at the cost of first the African and later the Asian people. In the previous couple of centuries, Europeans had made probably similarly large gains in their share of the world at the cost of the original people of Americas, whose population, which happened to be almost as large as that of Europe as a whole at that stage, was almost completely estimated. From about the middle of the 19th to the middle of the 20th century was a period of almost total European dominance of the world. The consequently of great strain for almost non-European people. During this period, the share of people of European origin in the population of the world rose by about 10 percentage points, while the share of other people correspondingly declined. This rapid rise in the proportion of European people, facilitated to some extent by the peopling of the American continent, came on top of a rise of about 7 percentage points in the previous century and perhaps nearly 3 centuries of continuous growth before that. In the 1930s, the share of European people in the population of the world reached its peak of nearly 40%. By the middle of the 20th century, most non-European people of the world began to come out of the long period of direct European rule. And with the coming of freedom, they began to experience a great blossoming of their populations. In the latter half of the 20th century, the share of African and Asian populations in the world rose sharply to largely neutralize the gains made by European people during the previous 100 years or so. India also participated in this great revival of non-European people. The share of people of Indian origin thus rose to above 20% of the population of the world from about 16% in 1950. Indian share in the world today is about the same as in 1850. Up to the middle of the last millennium, however, and perhaps up to the middle of the 18th century, we used to form a much larger part of the world. The people of Indian origin thus have improved their share in the population of the world considerably in the course of 20th century. The share of the Indian Union within and that of Indian religionists among the Indian, however, is a different story, as we have discussed earlier in this module. Thus, from the above discussion, we can conclude that thus seen in the perspective of the changing religious demography of the world during the 20th century, Indian situation does not seem too alarming. Christianity and Islam have both made substantial gains in the world, but it is Africa and some relatively smaller countries of Asia that have experienced the impact of growth of these religions the most. Africa has comprehensively lost its native religionist mournings during the 20th century, and in Asia, countries like Indonesia and South Korea have seen their religious complexion change fairly thoroughly. On the other hand, an Asian civilization like that of China has countenanced no change in its religious profile, nor have the relatively more recent civilizational regions of the world like West Africa, North Africa, and Europe swayed from their adopted faiths. India, however, has not remained unaffected. Between 1900 and 1990, Muslim share in the population of India has increased by about 8 percentage points to reach nearly 30%, and the share of Christians has increased by more than 1 percentage point to reach 2% of the population. Growth of Christianity in India during the 20th century has also been concentrated in specific geographical pockets, in some of which Christianity now form a predominant majority. Let us summarize what we have learned till now. A population defined in such a way can only change through three forces: births, deaths, and migration. These are called the three fundamental components of demographic change. Since the intensity of these forces differs greatly by age and gender, most demographic studies stratify the population by these two basic demographic dimensions. Religious affiliation is another characteristic that has been included in the consensus in the census of many countries. When it comes to the question of demographic modeling of the changing distribution of the religious composition of a population, differentials in fertility, mortality, and migration can be considered. Recently, the number and proportion of Muslims in many European countries has been increasing quite rapidly. The changing religious profiles of Indian population has had a strong impact on the recent history of India, and it continues to be amongst the major determinants of strife on the Indian subcontinent. Fortunately, unlike the caste and community affiliations, the religious affiliations of the people of India have always been recorded in the census operations. At the time of the first detailed census in 1881, the adherents of religions of native Indian origin constituted about 79% of the population, of which 95% were Hindus. Of the remaining, about 21% of the population that follows religions of alien origin, as many as 96% were Muslims. This religious heterogeneity of the Indian population and its division into mainly the Hindus and the Muslims was a demographic reflection of relatively recent events in Indian history. The proportion of Indian religionists in the population of India has declined by 11 percentage points during the period of 110 years for which census information is available. Indian religionists formed 79.32% of the population in 1881 and 68.3% in 1991. Correspondingly, the proportion of Muslims in India has increased by almost 10 percent points from about 20% to 30%. The proportion of Christians during the same period has risen from 0.7% to 2%. Thus, seen in the perspective of the changing religious demography of the world during the 20th century, Indian situation does not seem too alarming. Thank you.